Our faith can bring us into a wrestling match with God. Let me share a story with you from the Old Testament. It's a story of Jacob. And Jacob wrestles with God. He was the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham, the third Hebrew patriarch. This Jacob that we find in the Old Testament is a conflicted person. He's conniving. He shows glimpses of faith, but ultimately he is a selfish opportunist. And then he wrestles with God. We find part of his story in Genesis chapter 32. And this scene is the climax of Jacob's life. Here he finds his purpose. And in finding his purpose, he comes away with a limp. His name even changes from Jacob, which means cheater or heel grabber, to Israel, which means God fights or God prevails. God will draw us near by exposing the true struggle in our lives. The closer we get to God, the more we realize He's not like Santa Claus, this jolly gift giver to people on the nice list. He is an all-powerful God who has a plan to redeem people from sin. And sometimes redemption requires a struggle. So what led to the wrestling match between Jacob and God? Jacob's father Isaac received a promise from God. You will have a child who will point to a future Messiah. But then twins were born, Jacob and his brother Esau. Esau was the firstborn. Jacob, it says, came out second, holding the heel of his brother. Now, the culture at the time said that the oldest child received leadership and most of the wealth of the family. And this was in order to ensure that the family's spot in society was held, and it kept the wealth concentrated for the better of the family. But God told Isaac and his wife Rebekah something different, that the older would serve the younger. God had chosen Jacob, not Esau. Isaac didn't like God's choice. He preferred Esau. So when Isaac is about to die, he attempts to sidetrack God's will. But Jacob steps in and, true to his name, deceives his father who had become blind. Isaac then gives the birthright blessing to Jacob, thinking that it's Esau. Esau returns to the scene, and Isaac then realizes he's been deceived. Jacob then goes on the run. He runs from the land of promise. But despite his less than pure motives, Jacob becomes wealthy and successful. And about 20 years pass. There's a lot of family drama in the meantime, and Jacob decides, you know what, it's time to go home. All his wealth that he had acquired wasn't in the family. It wasn't what God had promised. So Jacob decides it's time to face what he knows is God's will. But the road home goes through Esau. So Jacob goes back to his old tricks. He schemes. His brother is ready to meet him, but with 400 men. Why are they there? Would this be war? So Jacob divides his camp in two in case Esau attacks, so that one of the two would survive. And he brings an enormous gift and sends it out in waves to his brother Esau. He then sends everyone else on first, and he falls back, and he is alone. Or is he? In the night, a mysterious figure attacks, and they wrestle for hours, all night long. Who is this mysterious figure? This ultimately the one who attacks Jacob dislocates Jacob's hip, and the wrestling is over. What appeared to be a match of equals is something entirely different. Then Jacob realizes who it is. Why did it take so long? Frankly, why is the Old Testament so long? I mean, for those of you who attend Westby, why are my sermons so long? Why won't God just reveal himself to us? I mean, here Jacob is struggling all night long. Doesn't know who it is. It's God himself. Why does God sometimes allow us to struggle? It's because our greatest struggle is understanding the real problems in our lives. Jacob thought his main problem was Esau. It wasn't. Jacob's whole life, he had been trying to create his own way. But he'd been wrestling God. Jacob thought closure was solving the problem with Esau. But that wasn't the main problem. He'd been focusing on the wrong struggle. When we draw near to God, when He pulls us towards Himself, He reveals the real struggle in our lives. For Jacob's whole life, he'd been used to using God to get his birthright. He left hastily. He returned for the wrong reasons. He was a schemer. He was an opportunist. He was selfish. And when we wrestle with God, our wounds, like Jacob, can be a sign of God's grace. You see, Jacob wrestled with God and wasn't killed. Think about that. God wrestled with him to reveal something. Now, God's all-powerful. He could have crushed Jacob. Frankly, He can crush you, but He doesn't. Why did Jacob receive just a touch of God's wrath? Why just the hip dislocation? Here's the answer. Because Jesus would ultimately receive what we deserve, all of it. The wound, the scar, the limp. It's a sign of God's grace, not His wrath. Why does God allow the wrestling? Because if He comes into your life only in power, He'd just wipe you out. If Jesus comes only in power, where's the grace in that? God could easily win the battle. But in doing so, He would have lost Jacob, and ultimately He would lose us too. So here we have this story of a struggle, and a man who moves from being a cheater, a heel grabber, Jacob, to his new name that God gives him, Israel, which means God fights, God prevails. All of Jacob's schemes were unnecessary because God was in control. Now, there's so much mystery to this story, and one quick devotional can't do it justice. I mean, for 20 years, Jacob attempted his own thing. 20 years. But then God worked it out. Two spiritually broken families are brought back together. Jacob didn't deserve God's favor. Esau didn't deserve God's favor. We don't deserve God's favor. But anyone who accepts Jesus Christ receives God's grace. Grace is simply unmerited favor from an unobligated giver. So, wrestle with God. All He's trying to do is to get you to accept His grace.